Welcome to the session on pedagogy in the classroom. We have 3 panelists here today, and we'll give you 2 minutes to present or so. And when it gets closer to the ending point, I'll show up little signs just to let you know that try to wrap up as best you can, but I certainly don't want to cut you off. Would you prefer having questions right after or all at the end?
What do you all prefer?
Yeah, that's me as well. What would you
I think
prefer?
it's nice to save it for the end so that we make sure that each presenter has enough time.
Okay. Yeah, does that sound
And
good?
you can get all the presentations in and then whatever's remaining.
Sounds good to me, yeah. All right, so that's what we'll do then. So please save your questions and maybe jot them down, and then we'll have a question and answer at the end. Okay, so today we're starting out with, excuse me, Pamela June, who is an assistant professor of English at Ohio University, the Eastern Campus. And her presentation is entitled From Rural to Urban Classrooms, Animal Liberation in Post-Secondary Education. Pamela B. June is an assistant professor of English at Ohio University Eastern Campus. She earned her PhD in 2009 and her MA in 2005 in English Literature and Criticism from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and her BA in 2004 in English from the University of Pittsburgh. Originally from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, June has taught IUP and at Payne College, an historically black college in Georgia, before joining the faculty at Ohio University in 2013. She teaches women's literature, American literature, and writing, and she researches and publishes on women's literature. Her current project, a book examining eco-feminist issues in Alice Walker's fiction, is forthcoming from the University of Illinois Press. Without further ado. All right, thanks.
As more students enroll in college and university courses, faculty are seeing an unprecedented number of students from diverse and historically underrepresented backgrounds. Whether from underprivileged farming communities in rural areas or underfunded school districts in inner cities, students bring different skill sets and different ideologies into their post-secondary education. My presentation today will draw on my experiences teaching at a southern inner-city historically black college, or HBCU for short, and at a northern rural predominantly white institution, or PWI for short. While major differences exist between these groups of students, some striking similarities remain, and it is in these similarities where, as educators, faculty can begin to explore animal liberation as a pedagogical and theoretical lens. My presentation will begin by offering examples of my experiences in both settings, and then to explore specific lesson plans which included issues of animal liberation. If time remains, or maybe during the Q&A at the end, I would like to invite suggestions from the audience about any appropriate, successful uses of critical animal studies that you've seen or used in the classroom. So first, just to give you a little bit of background on the different experiences I've had teaching in different settings, the HBCU in Georgia, where I taught, was a private religious college, and I faced various issues related to critical animal studies. First, the students are in many ways removed from what they see as nature. Many had never traveled outside the city, and many had had relatively few experiences with non-human animals. In neighborhoods that surround this inner city campus, fast food chains have sprung up at an alarming rate, reflecting the disconnection with food sources that many urban areas face. Because factory farms and concentrated animal feeding operations are located in areas far removed from heavily populated neighborhoods, cities often lack exposure to the source of our food. Moreover, there is an historic aversion to the concept of evolution in this community, as students keenly perceive the ways in which their race has been dehumanized and animalized throughout history. The students' reaction is understandable, considering that connections to animals have been used to denigrate African Americans for centuries. This point allows an interesting way into critical animal studies in the classroom. Scientist and ecofeminist Linda Burke points out that women, and I would add African Americans, have had to deal with, quote, the danger of being seen as closer to animals or nature. Burke says that we resist being reduced to the level of the beast within, the animal, or the dark side of ourselves. This opposition to biological determinism has been part of the work for women and for minorities. However, ecofeminists now realize that denying our connection to animals and nature has been part of what legitimates the destruction of animals and nature. If it is an insult to be called a cow, a bitch, or a pig, it must be undesirable to actually be those animals. Therefore, Burke concludes we should not reject our connection to animals, and moreover, reclaiming these connections actually makes sense for women and minorities. Breeze Harper's edited collection, Sister Vegan, brings together writers of color who argue that veganism is a natural ally to women of color for many reasons. For instance, Michelle Lloyd Page says, seeing a connection between the treatment of feed animals, laying chickens, and people of color is a rather recent phenomenon for me, but the connection becomes clear with a careful reading of our history and an understanding of the true nature of food production in the United States. This realization might be a good way into the discussion of critical animal studies at an HBCU. However, at the predominantly white institution in rural Ohio where I now teach, the students have very different life experiences. My tiny branch campus is nestled in the hills of the Ohio River Valley, and all of the students are commuters. They come from distant areas of the countryside, and the nearest city, Wheeling, West Virginia, draws only 1 or 2 students a year. Far from the city, these students often interact with the non-human world. Many were raised in farming and mining households, and they have frequent interactions with animals. Many are from families who hunt. Most have pets of some sort, and quite a few of my students are members of 4-H or other organizations that raise and show animals, many of whom will later be slaughtered. Despite the students' intimate knowledge of non-human animals, they are shocked when they find out that I am vegetarian. The Ohio Valley apparently doesn't have many of us. Some of the students' responses are positive. On 3 separate occasions this semester, students approached me at my office or after class to inquire about veganism. One student has been raised vegetarian and is now working to go vegan. Another, one of my English majors, is not vegetarian but was genuinely curious when he found out that I was vegan, and he indicated that he and his girlfriend are now considering going veg. And just this week, a student stayed after class to talk with me about the film Food Inc., which she had just watched. It was her reading of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in my American Lit class that spurred her interest in food production. Other students, though, typically white males, have reacted with suspicion and even mockery. One saw me ordering a veggie sandwich for lunch, and he said, somewhat snidely, "Oh yeah, you don't eat meat, do you?" And when I said no, and there's no cheese on this sandwich either, he made a demonstrable nonverbal reaction. Another student posted on Blackboard online discussions in response to my biography that he enjoys, quote, foods rich in chocolate and animal products. Just kidding about the chocolate. This past week, a young woman at the campus cafe noted that I am the, quote, biggest hummus addict that she's ever met. When I told her that I try not to eat things made from animals, she responded she could never do that. Still other students query my spouse, who is now a lecturer at the same institution. How do you eat at home with a vegan wife? What kinds of things does she eat? And he teaches a plant biology course, and his students asked him recently if they would lose extra credit on the veganism question on the midterm exam. And so on. Mostly, though, the students are good-natured, and they're benefiting, I think, from their first exposure to a vegetarian. I would now like to offer some examples of some of my lesson plans in these environments, and this is kind of a nice extension of the discussion that was begun yesterday in the large lecture hall, where we were thinking about classroom experiences and pedagogy. And I've just recently tried to start working issues of critical animal studies into my classrooms with varying levels of success. So this is where at the end of the presentation or after the other panelists have presented, maybe we can get some ideas going about other potentially successful uses. Because I am finding there has been some resistance in both settings. When I was teaching at the HBCU, I wasn't really in the field of critical animal studies at that point. So now reflecting back, I'm thinking of different ways that I could have worked these ideas into the classroom. So for the last couple of years teaching at OU, I've been working in these issues in a few different ways. Our research always affects our pedagogy, and so it would be impossible for me to somehow check my eco-feminist leanings at the classroom door. My goal is not to turn my students into mini-me's who just regurgitate what I tell them, but rather to share my expertise and give them new windows, new lenses to explore the literature that I teach. Therefore, I work the theories with which I'm most familiar into my classes in a few ways. Ken Bain's book, What the Best College Teachers Do, notes that the best instructors create a natural, critical learning environment where people learn by confronting intriguing, beautiful, or important problems, authentic tasks that will challenge them to grapple with ideas, rethink their assumptions, and examine their mental modes of reality. I believe that if students are entirely comfortable, they're not pushed to think critically and therefore to challenge their assumptions. Those intriguing, beautiful, and important problems then can be tackled from a critical animal studies lens that will help the students to rethink their preconceived notions. In composition classes, I typically teach nonfiction essays so that the students have models for writing and can see argumentation in action. For the past year, I've begun the semester with Alice Walker's classic essay, Am I Blue? In the essay, Walker describes her experiences with a horse named Blue, whom she visited and fed. Blue meets Brown, a horse who is brought simply to breed. The two horses, however, develop a relationship, and when Brown is taken away, Blue is visibly unhappy. Blue's narrative, which Walker uses as an allegory for slavery and oppression of various kinds, details the horse's pain and suffering. Witnessing his obvious distress, Walker contemplates that animals are, quote, forced to become for us merely images of what they once so beautifully expressed. In sharing this animal's grief, Walker concludes the essay by noting that anyone concerned about social justice cannot logically partake in eating animals. As we talked of freedom and justice one day for all, we sat down to steaks. I am eating misery, I thought, as I took the first bite and spit it out. This essay begins the semester, and later in the semester, I use the film Food, Inc. to introduce the concept of argumentation. The film does not have an overtly vegetarian agenda, which makes it palatable for students. It does have a strongly anti-corporatization bent, and the students are sympathetic to this cause. They react with anger when they realize how their food supply has been monopolized and streamlined to create huge profit margins at the expense of the workers, the animals, the environment, and the consumer's health. This film has worked well to get students writing about and researching topics related to agribusiness and animal ethics, problematic as both Walker and Film Food Inc. are. They've been successful on these levels. I also teach literature, and I have begun introducing eco-critical and eco-feminist theories, explaining to the students how these theories investigate characters' interactions with the non-human world. In my American Lit class recently, I broke the students into groups to analyze Sarah Orne Jewett's short story, A White Heron. Each group received a literary theory and a handout that explained it. Marxist, feminist, formalist, psychoanalytic, eco-critical theories, among others. The questions posed on the eco-critical handout were as follows. How does nature function in the story? How do the characters interact with the non-human environment? How are non-human animals represented? What ethical choices are related to the natural world? And what ideological, social, historical, or political meanings are related to nature? If you're not familiar with the story of White Heron, a young girl named Sylvia is asked by a hunter to help him find a coveted white heron. The hunter owns a formidable assortment of stuffed birds, but he feels the heron will be the capstone on his prodigious collection. Swept away by her burgeoning romantic feelings and by the promise of money for herself and her grandmother, young Sylvia sets out the next morning to find the heron's nest. She climbs high in a tree and eventually locates the nest. Elated, she runs back home to share the news with the hunter who has stayed overnight with them. However, along the way, as she walks through the woods, she changes her mind and decides not to tell him after all. She sides with nature and the non-human world rather than the human, the hope of love, and material gain. The ethical choice at the heart of the story pits the young girl and the natural non-human world against the side of the masculine, the threat of violence, and the exploitation of wealth. I currently teach African American literature, and in the writing, the students notice that animalized language is used frequently. If I could return to the HBCU where I taught for 3 years, I might ask my students these questions, and I wonder how they might respond. In Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, Beneatha refers to her brother Walter as, quote, a toothless rat. Bigger Thomas in Richard Wright's Native Son is also connected with a rat, in addition to plentiful animalized language throughout the novel. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, Setha and Paul D both react with hostility to any implied connections with animals. Questions that I would pose might include these. Why does the author use animalized language? In what ways is the protagonist connected to animals? In what ways does this language further legitimize his or her oppression? In what ways does this language further legitimize the oppression of animals or of nature? By posing these questions, I would hope to get the students thinking about the ways in which, while the characters are animalized and oppressed, animals are doubly oppressed. So I would like to conclude today by inviting you to think back to any moments when you effectively used critical animal studies or eco-critical, eco-feminist theories in the classroom, or if you're not an educator, when you saw these issues introduced in the classroom. And questions that I'd like you to think about, and maybe we can get some feedback later in the panel today, would be what texts, films, or resources have been effective? How do you respond to the claim that you have an agenda? How do you respond to resistant students? And with these questions in mind, I would like to conclude my portion of the panel for today. Thank you.
Okay, so next up we have Trevor Reddick, and he's going to be presenting an argument for Native studies toward a critical animal and anti-colonial pedagogy. Trevor Reddick is a senior at Binghamton University studying English and philosophy. He was a successful debater for Binghamton University's speech and debate team and has been coaching their teams this year to unprecedented success. He's going to be pursuing graduate level studies either in mass communications or public policy, where he will be coaching debate as well. He's interested in music theory, the intersections of Native and Black studies, and literary analysis of fiction, especially New Americanist studies.
Okay. Hi, everybody. First, I'd like to start with a little discussion of what research is and the dangers of potential research. So, specifically in regards to discussions of indigenous communities, and specifically the warnings of anthropological violence done through the perspective of Western observers who try to rationally interpret and fix into frames particular cultural understandings which are defied by some of the base assumptions that we have. However, what I hope to present today is not necessarily an ethnographic or anthropological piece, but rather an unpacking of some under-theorized histories as a means of justifying the inclusion of Native studies in university classrooms, and specifically here. My goal is to forward arguments for why Native studies is important, specifically for forwarding critical animal studies aspirations, while magnifying its political potentiality through coalition around the question of colonialism. Now first, the question is, what is colonialism and why does it matter? This historical epoch, modernity, is characterized by a general attitude, a worldview predicated on how we constitute subjecthood and objecthood. Von Deloria Jr. refers to this as Cartesian subjectivity, and as he explains, the history of Western thinking has been one of replacement of ideas within a framework that has remained unchanged for nearly 2 millennia. Challenging this framework of interpretation means a rearrangement of our manner of perceiving the world, and a re-examination of the body of human knowledge and its structural reconstruction into a new format. Numerous examples can be cited to show that our efforts to bring justice into the world have been short-circuited, and that those efforts are unsuccessful because we have failed to consider the basic framework within which we pose questions, analyze alternatives, and suggest solutions. Example after example can be cited, testifying to the devastating effects of the general attitude for the world that underlies the Western approach to knowledge. The basis of this attitude is the assumption of the world operates in certain predetermined, and that the nature of every species is homogeneous. Once we reject Western conceptions, we're able to see different types of questions inherent in our immediate problem areas. Thus, I bring you to native studies as a particular way to question this framework and to understand a new relationship to the world. But the question is, what is native studies? I argue that it is a growing body of work dedicated to the uncovering of untold histories and the reclamation of space and place through the building of knowledge on and about Native communities and their ongoing existence and fights for survival and recognition in the United States. Specifically, I argue that to instill the academy with what Sandy Grande calls red pedagogy will require an attunement to the particular spaces and places of the academy to understand its genocidal history, its continued implication in the ongoing genocide against blacks and Native Americans, and the importance of altering our relationship to land and space. Dylan Rodriguez, professor at UC Riverside, explains in 2011 that the university does not merely benefit from genocide, but rather perpetuates it through the banal mapping of it over indigenous lands and black bodies. He explains it specifically in the context of UC Riverside, which is built on a native burial ground, but also argues that it is not just different structures of oppressive violence that radical scholars are trying to make legible. It is violence of a certain depth, with specific and morbid implications for some people's future existences as such. If we can begin to acknowledge this fundamental truth, that genocide is this place, the American Academy, and in fact America itself, then our operating assumptions, askable questions, and scholarly methods will need to transform. At a moment of historical emergency, we might find principled desperation within intellectual courage. And so the question becomes, why Native studies here? Why is it important in this place? The land we know as Binghamton, and New York State in general, has been home to some of the most vicious institutionalized racism and oppression in the North and throughout the country. Yet this history is constantly ignored and hidden. New York State had some of the earliest Native American slaves, and through grandfather clauses held on to slaves far beyond nearly any other state in the entire country. This knowledge is important here because this history is entirely unfamiliar. People relegate colonialism and its impacts to the past, always relegating these indigenous communities and their issues to the past as well. This is something that even the most well-meaning academics and people engaged in these discussions unfortunately participate in. Those people who lived and continue to live on this land, though en masse displaced, are the Onondaga Nation, known colloquially as the Iroquois, or in their mother tongue, the Haudenosaunee, meaning people building a longhouse. Their origin stories in the culture and carbon dating of the oldest known Onondaga habitation sites place their origin here around 1142 to 1200 AD. So, if you look at most county websites, you'll see that history seemingly starts about late 1600s, early 1700s. As soon as some good old Europeans show up. So the point is that we need to rethink the way that we conceptualize history itself. The Onondaga lived peacefully until contact, when frontier slavers and traders of the Dutch variety began to exploit and also create trading relationships. The Haudenosaunee remained neutral in most public disputes, including and up until the end of the Revolutionary War. Barbara Alice Mann, in her excellent George Washington's War on Native Americans, writes that George Washington, in a perhaps intentional misunderstanding of the Iroquois League, its role in military interventions in upstate New York, or otherwise, sent a regime to clear out the Iroquois people in an attempted final solution to the Indian problem in upstate New York. In April 1779, General Goose Van Schaik attacked men, women, and children and burned more than 8 miles of Onondaga villages and crops, beginning at Onondaga Lake. Generals Sullivan and Clinton continued the campaign, focusing on the Cayuga and Seneca nations. While most Haudenosaunee have fled to reserves in Ontario, many live on a 7,300 square acre reserve just south of Syracuse, where to this day they question the legitimacy of claims made to this land by the United States federal government in the Supreme Court, in front of international actors, and in the public sphere. Specifically, a court case that was just overturned again by the Supreme Court attempted to not try to take the land back, but simply have the United States admit that they had taken the land from the Haudenosaunee people. Something like that is absolutely impossible for the United States to ever give claim to, because it would undermine the very legitimacy of its existence itself. And thus, the fight continues. This gets to the very first reason about why it's crucial for Native studies, and that it is literally important for people in this space to become educated on the colonialist legacy that they inherit and exist within. We can see it through the discourse that circles around this place. If you're from Binghamton or have been around here for a little bit, you'll see that almost everything around here is named after Iroquois words, after Native American groups, after communities, different words and experiences. All these things are named for and by Native Americans, yet are reclaimed and used by Europeans. So we have to understand the histories that we're built up in. Second is that appreciation and learning about indigenous worldviews can provide crucial moments for intervention against environmental challenges, speciesism, colonialism, and a host of other issues. They provide critical insights and reflections on what constitutes knowledge, how we construct our worldviews, and provide a crucial alternative relationship to the spaces and places we inhabit. Vine Deloria Jr. in his Magnificent For This Land writes that while each tribe throughout the United States have very different stories and histories, that they share some certain characteristics and common ideas, like a net of life and a rejection of linear time. I hope to address the specific origin story of the Haudenosaunee people to bring attention to the importance of avoiding romanticism and applying legitimate cultural analysis and criticism. Karen was right in the public debate that we were discussing yesterday about how some people are very quick to use other cultures as perfect touchstones for an attempt to try and teach us something about ourselves and others. And that can very much participate within a violent paradigm of relationship to people and their experiences. What I hope to do here is explain a little bit of the origin story of the Haudenosaunee people and allow us to understand a little bit of how it can relate to some environmental ethical ideas. So the Haudenosaunee create spiritual connections with the world and land around them, specifically through the figures of Mother Earth and Father Sky found in their earliest creation stories. Throughout the stories, there is a dominant theme of family relation. The sky holder and his wife, Mature Flowers, exist in the sky world. They are caretakers of the tree of life. The wife falls to the earth and is caught and cared for by the animals of the earth. There can be seen at this point the development of a cooperative and caring connection between the spiritual world and the physical world. The emerging relationship is harmonious and nurturing. She is placed upon the back of a giant snapping turtle, which is covered with mud and forms the fertile land that she can then plant and grow food upon and with. The snapping turtle plays a significant role in the culture of the Haudenosaunee, symbolizing the land upon which they live. To this day, many Haudenosaunee refer to North America as Turtle Island. As the creation story progresses, the Sky Woman gives birth to a daughter whom herself dies, giving birth to twins. The daughter is buried and becomes known as Mother Earth. From her death grows the three sisters of corn, beans, and squash. Again, it is important to note the theme of kinship. There is a predominant connection between the family of the spiritual world and all the inhabitants of Turtle Island. The individual strands of connection are being drawn together into the sacred web of life, what I'd like to call a cosmological worldview. The story continues on to describe the twins who represent good and evil, but it's a very long story which I can't really get into here, especially considering the time. But particularly the final acts of the story are crucial for addressing this relationship. The final acts of creation of the story involve the introduction of the races of the people. Through the good-minded brother, because they come to represent the good versus evil, nature is used to create the various races. Asians are created from the yellow bark of a tree, Caucasians from the great salt sea, Africans from the dark rich soil, Native Americans from the reddish clay. These final stories of creation emphasize the deep spiritual connection between the people and the land. They literally are born of them. The closing paragraph of the creation story does a tremendous job of drawing the deep meaning out of the story and completing this cosmological or sacred web of life. As it's written, the good-minded brother taught the people the use and living with of the plants and animals, ceremonies of thanksgiving to live in harmony and peace. We have come to refer to him as Samphitsin, the creator. Before departing from the earth, he struck a deal with the people. We are to protect his gifts of creation and be respectful of all living things. And we're to be simply thankful for all that he has provided, as he has given us all that we need to live a happy life. In return for showing thanks, we would strive to keep the cycles of life continuing for the benefit of the people. So Mishawanagoman, Dinesh scholar and poet, explains the importance that these stories play in the continued survival of culture and native peoples. Seeing land as storied and providing stories from time immemorial, rather than as a confined place within rigid boundaries, will remind us of the responsibility to each other. People still speak of the sacredness of places now claimed by the park services, or even those grave sites found under shopping malls. Referring specifically to Black Hills, for example, or the Ohlone grave sites buried under the Emeryville Wall in California's Bay Area. As poet Kimberly Blaser states, story remains the heartbeat of Indian community. The account may have morals, the mystery of life, but always reinforce our connections. By centering us in a network of relationships, stories assure the survival of our spirits. Stories are also situated within knowledge systems. Language doesn't merely reflect the actual, but has the power to construct reality. Indigenous writers, in their use of spatial metaphors, are not simply inverting the colonial narrative, but instead are using metaphors to construct working frameworks for the contemporary moment. Through narrative, or the history, story, memory, or experiences recalled, we can recreate meanings of land through language. Land in our relationship to it is narrated and more flexible in time and space than the boundaries set up for the discourse of colonialism that seek to fix it. One story recalls another, open up land to various nodes rather than limit or erase possibilities. So this is a lot of the discussion that occurs around how indigenous communities and people conceptualize things like maps, and there's a lot of historical analysis of how indigenous maps are much more inclusive rather than exclusive in the way that they draw boundaries, and that the connections between different parts of the land are lived relationships, that it's just like a relationship to another person. It's attuned to very specific emotions and spiritual feelings, etc. And so there's always a lot of variation and distinctions that can occur between them, which is the dividing line that people like to draw between like the Western paradigm of an exclusive way of thinking, that we draw this map around Binghamton University and see it as a very fixed boundary, but don't understand the relationship that the physical aspects of this land have with certain people and the spiritual connection that arises. Now, Joy and Gregory Greenberg, PhDs and MAs in mythological studies, contextualize the important roles these stories can play in teaching paradigms. Now, Native American reverence for sacred sites indicates a strong place sense experienced in traditional cultures, fundamental to indigenous cultural identity and social organization. Non-indigenous Americans are by definition detached from place, lacking an archaic connection to not just land, but this land. Non-natives otherize their surroundings, which become mere objects for exploitation. American settling was often regarded like Jesus' wandering in the desert. Nature was a howling wilderness to be tamed and dominated. Colonization a test of faith and endurance of those willing to take up the tribe. Sacred places are significant for Native Americans, for whom birds, animals, and plants compose the other people of creation, says Deloria. Traditional Indian people see the whole of creation as an active participant in ceremonial life. Academic Lawrence W. Gross is among those who believes that for his and other indigenous people, myths teach morality, especially environmental ethics. Vine Deloria Jr. views myths as finding the proper road. Individuals are supposed to walk. And eco-cultural knowledge informs mythic narratives about lives lived in reciprocal communication with a meta-human world. Zolbrod says that Native American narratives embody this ecological knowledge and systemic observation to preserve vital cultural knowledge by projecting primordial cosmic origins from elements observed in the everyday world to produce poetically complex cosmological stories. These stories present American Indians as students of their environment who develop a land ethic based on experience and recognition of reciprocity. Attitudinal change must come from an expansion of awareness of what tribally centered oral traditions can contribute to developing a sense of place, what we call indigenization of knowledge. It is about re-envisioning the native ethos as an eco-ethical narrative of place that allows non-natives potential access to a partial indigenous perspective, or rather a reorientation of their perspective based on indigenous worldviews. Eco-ethical narratives of place tell stories of the land imbued with sacredness. Hearing, telling, reading, and participating in place narratives may alleviate non-native existential alienation and allow replacement, promoting respect for and concrete political solidarity with Native Americans, says Bron Taylor. Natives and non-natives internalize the eco-ethicality inherent within traditional stories. I hope that a little bit of this has explained some of the importance that Native American worldviews should play in our ongoing lives, the ongoing role that colonialism plays in all of our lives and the relationships that we take to non-humans and other entities, and that engaging with these stories, with these histories, and these peoples and these communities specifically, and that's one of the most important things I want to emphasize, is that it can't just be about the ideas, it has to be about the people and the communities that live here as those who can teach us and teach them and teach others, and also reclaim for themselves these stories and narratives that are constantly being taken away from them through things like these Supreme Court decisions. So I hope to impose a little, import upon you a little bit of what I think is the reasons we should have Native Studies, especially considering Binghamton University and its place in one of the most important historical instances of colonization in America, and how we have one Native American Studies course that's offered, and it is absolutely an embarrassment, and it's not taught by somebody that even went through an undergraduate program or any graduate program in Native American Studies, and does not seem to have a lot of knowledge, intimate knowledge of the groups and communities that live here. So I think calling for institutionalized Native Studies is a way for us to start to make moves toward having people, especially in this place, come to grips with the historical legacy of colonialism and the important role that it continues to play in our lives, and hopefully to bring it together with critical annual studies and some of the other philosophical interventions that we think are important. Thank you.
Is going to be talking about teaching critical animal studies beyond the bounds of gradability. J.L. Schatz is a lecturer in English and feminist evolutionary theory at Binghamton University, where he also serves as the director of speech and debate. He has published essays on environmentalism and apocalypse, critical pedagogy, technology and transhumanism, disability studies, and cultural theory.
Thank you. So I believe that in teaching critical theory, there has to be a purpose to teaching critical theory, and not just writing a paper or getting published at the end of the day. And a lot of students who take classes are taking classes to get a grade, to get a degree, and then to go to grad school or get a job or something along those lines. I think that as educators, there's an imperative to do something more when we teach people than just teaching them. And as students, I think it's imperative that students take the knowledge that they get and do something with that as well. That there's a need to somehow figure out ways to take what we teach in the classroom and bring it into day-to-day lives as students, or for those of you who are students, take this stuff that you're learning in class and bring it into your day-to-day life. And so the reason why I say beyond the bounds of gradability is that within academia, there are certain things that are often considered gradable. The paper that you turn in, how you function in class discussion, and things like that. But what's not considered gradable is what takes place outside of that classroom. So like what happens when someone's not in that room, or the 5 minutes before class actually starts is generally considered not gradable. When somebody eats in the dining hall is considered not gradable. These things are stuff that I think we should begin to question and say, maybe education should not just be about what we can academically put on paper, but how do we change the lived embodied experiences that people have. As a primary assumption of my presentation, I believe that we have to take speciesism seriously, and not just as another interesting category for academic analysis, but as an ethical and political imperative. This implies doing everything we can to dismantle the linguistic, conceptual, and performative apparatus which makes all kinds of violence and oppression possible. We also must understand that the politics of consumption is more than just sort of like boycott veganism and what we put in our mouths. Rather, when we digest academic material, there's also an imperative that we do something with that actual knowledge and not just happen to take it as sort of like the flavor of the week or the theory of the month, right? We have to do something more than that. Bell quotes Stuart and Elizabeth Iwin in Channels of Desire, where they write that the politics of consumption must be understood as more than what to buy or even what to boycott. Consumption is a social relationship, the dominant relationship in our society, one that makes it harder and harder for people to hold together and to create community. At a time when for many of us the possibility of meaningful change seems to elude our grasp, is a question of immense social and political proportions. To establish popular initiative, consumerism must be transcended, a difficult but central task facing all people who still seek a better way of life. And so what I take away from that quote is that obviously we consume in a lot of ways beyond just what we eat. We're consuming when we go to a conference, we're consuming when we turn on the lights, we're consuming when we think about things. And something that's, my students have brought to me that's important when dealing with sort of like Native studies or Black studies and things like that is engage with the text, because otherwise what happens is that we uncritically consume things just to advance our own academic careers without actually doing something substantial with it. And so I began to ask, as I engage in speciesist and literature, and I think about the ways in which to create change, how do I teach the literature that I'm assigning in a way that will be able to actually promote change outside of the classroom? So, it started as an experiment within the debate community. When you judge a debate round, you decide a winner and a loser, and then you also give speaker points to individual speakers. So I modified my judge philosophy to say anyone who commits to going vegetarian at tournaments will get an extra speaker point from me. And if you commit from going vegan, maybe a second speaker point. If you're already vegetarian, you gotta go vegan. If you're already vegan, you gotta think of doing something else that'll be equivalent, right? And so, predictably, there was a large backlash against me in the community. You could find a bunch of forum threads of people saying that this is destroying debate, that I'm being a horrible person, I'm just interjecting my own opinions. And I responded back, well, with some of the quotes from this presentation, but also with the argument that as a judge, our job is to be educators, not just adjudicators. And so to do something that would inspire people to make a change in an environment where it's possible. When you go to a debate tournament, you register for what type of food you would like. So it's just as easy for people to have vegetarian and vegan options. So issues of like class, food deserts, accessibility issues weren't an issue here because they could register in a way where they could have that food available. And so it was doing something that caused people to leave their comfort zone in order to be able to try new things. So two things happened. First, a bunch of people stopped prepping me as a judge, so I stopped judging them. But secondly, a bunch of people took the Veg Pledge and started going vegetarian at tournaments for this extra speaker point. And what they normally tell me is, I've always wanted to go vegetarian, but I just never had the incentive to do it. And I was like, okay, so really the extra speaker point is that incentive. So it's strange, but it was working. And people were saying that, what I realized is when I went out to dinner with my team who was paying for my meal, it was easy for me to find something to eat that was vegetarian in the menu. I just never looked at that section before. And so there's plenty of people who I've remained in contact with who have stayed vegetarian or gone vegan and promoted that message because of a speaker point. And so I was like, okay, this is great, so now I'm going to do it in my classes. So I started offering extra credit, 3 extra credit points on your final paper if you go vegetarian for the semester or over spring break, 6 points if you go vegan. And it's a self-monitoring one. I'm not able to please the students at home, and I give it like, well, if you're going to lie to me, that's really on you. I don't really care a whole lot, but you should really think about this. And at the end, write up to me why you believe you deserve that extra credit, and I will give you the amount of extra credit that you think is appropriate. And I think students, by and large, responded honestly to the interrogation, and most of them would fail at various different points. But the overwhelming emphasis was that it was much easier than I thought to do. It wasn't that much more expensive. And it's something that I've always played around with doing, but I never did it. And so it was a little disheartening that all it took to get people to actually try was being like, here's some extra, here's some, extra points on your paper. And for me, it's like, whatever, I'll give you some extra points, it's not gonna change my life, but it tangibly changed the lives of animals and took the literature that they were reading and started being able to figure out a way to internalize them into their day-to-day lives. And which was an incredibly powerful act. And it reminds me of like, I think it's Mercy for Animals. It gives people $1 to watch the, their Meet Your Meat video or whatever it is, right? And that changes people. And why do people sit down and reach it for $1, right? And clearly the dollar doesn't matter, but that like little financial capitalist incentive, just like extra credit points or speaker points, is enough to be that tipping scale to get people to do something more. And so, in order to teach and grade things that are ungradable, you have to come up with creative ways to figure out how to inspire people to allow those elements of their lives to become gradable and make it something different for them, opposed to, well, instead of a paper, you got to do a project. And so the project will still go through the traditional things, and you're going to have to present it at the end, is have them do something else in terms of like actually changing their life. Right, so I also got a lot of criticism. I was called into the department. The department was like, okay, so we hear you're giving extra credit for people going vegetarian. Why are you forcing people to go vegetarian? It's not objective. Right, and so I'm just like, well, first, in the English department, objectivity is not really upheld as like this wonderful thing anyhow. So that was easy to get past. But then it was also like, students don't have to do this, right? They could choose not to, and they could get the same grade that they'd always get, and so it's just a bonus for those people who have it. And they're like, well, that's still unfair because grades are relative to one another. And so I made a parallel with sort of feminist studies. It's like if there is a male student in a feminist studies class and they are able to write incredible papers, but I hear them constantly being like, oh, this person's a bitch and using all sorts of problematic language, that person doesn't deserve an A in the class because even though they talk the talk, they haven't actually walked the walk. They haven't learned a way to actually figure out a way to master the material into their everyday life. So someone who's taking a critical animal studies course or stuff on critical animals, if they're eating meat or consuming dairy, they have clearly not, and they're not a student because they haven't realized the ways in which that their lives are intersecting with those forms of power. So, objectivity has long been seen by feminists as gendered, obviously. Structuring what counts as knowledge, and which has been defined in particular ways the way that of people who are generally white, male, and middle class. An example of such feminist work, and I'm going to quote a ICAS Donna Haraway, who argues that objectivity was associated in the 18th century with English gentlemanliness and masculinity and his enlightenment, quest for knowledge. That was seen as transparent, independent, rational, honorable, quite the opposite of the feminine and those who were seen as dark, uncivil, and unruly. So I began to continue to toy with, well, subjectivity. If I'm teaching through a subjective lens, what's to stop another professor with the entire opposite of the perspective that says you should hunt in order to be able to get extra credit, to be able to do that, right? If everything's equally subjective, then there's nothing that makes me right and this other professor wrong. So I continued reading, and there are other ways that we can understand objectivity. Again, Donna Haraway writes that feminist objectivity means quite simply situated knowledges that help students learn to situate the assumptions, limitations, and political and social influences of any particular research or creative project. In order to do so, students need to explore the gaps of research questions, representational techniques, and the traditional disciplines have adopted, to learn alternative cultural readings and viewing strategies, and to incorporate the center of feminist analysis and questions concerning learning and epistemology. So what this means is that you don't have to default to pure subjectivity or moral relativism. Rather, we have to admit that we have agendas, that there is something as teachers that we want to promote. Why would you want to take a course with a teacher who doesn't have an agenda to teach you the subject that you're taking, right? So you would think that if I was taking a feminist theory course, I'd want a professor who had an agenda to promote feminist theory. Otherwise, it's not going to be a really meaningful course because it's not going to be taught from a position of passion. And what we need to look at is, why do people come up with these subjective understandings of things, and look at those gaps between research, between those sort of stuff, those moments where it's ungradable, or the moments where we live our lives outside of academia and begin to do that. So I decided extra credit wasn't enough. So I modified my syllabus now to have 10% of the grade based upon internalization of course material, is what I call it. And I allow students to grade themselves and reflect on what it is that they've done to internalize the material that's assigned. In the class Media and Politics where I do this, there's a unit on racism, a unit on sexism, a unit on ableism, a unit on speciesism. And so there's a bunch of different things in each that they can do. In each one of these units, I express different ways that you go about doing it. For instance, people are still saying, oh, that's so gay. And so one thing that they do is every time their friends say that, they could call them out on and say, you shouldn't be saying that. Other ones who are in frats, they'd be like, well, the advertisements you're posting for your parties are clearly very sexist. How about you work on changing the advertisement? Don't get rid of the parties if you like the parties, but change the way that you're advertising to begin to change the culture and things like that. And so each unit I give examples of ways that you can internalize it within your life. Stop shopping at Walmart. And what's interesting about the stop shopping at Walmart is the same way everything else is. It's like, well, it's just cheaper, I need to go there. So I engage in the question, it's like, okay, so you know it's bad, you know it's coming from sweatshops. So if that t-shirt was $6 at another store and $4 at Walmart, would you pay it? And they're like, yeah, I'd pay $2 more for non-sweatshop. And it's normally about $5 where the t-shirt stops. At coffee's about $1 more where they stop saying free trade is good. And then so what you have done is that you literally put an economic cost on what you're willing to exploit. And so you should question yourself every time that you go shopping, knowing that you're doing things that you disagree with, because no one in my class defends sweatshops. No one really defends a lot of these oppressive politics, but they do it because they just don't see another way. And so what I try and do is so now there's a portion of the syllabus where every time you make a choice about how you're choosing to consume what's being said, what's going on the internet, or shopping, that you're grading yourself on your rigorous thought and the way that you engage in it. And that doesn't mean you never buy coffee that might not be fair trade, but it means you ask yourself, when you make that choice, why did you make that choice? And then you think about those sort of things. And I think this is essential for students to do, even when the instructor doesn't require it this way. Start thinking about the material and how it can be internalized and how you should change living based upon the things that you've read, opposed to just sort of uncritically consuming it. And I think there's an obligation for teachers to grade those components that are outside what is traditionally considered gradable. The student who writes an amazing, critical animal studies paper but continues to eat flesh, again, hasn't mastered that material. And in either case, it's important not to just promote education as a liberal enterprise where all views are equal and someone's choice to eat flesh is merely a personal choice, right? It's not a personal choice, it's a political choice, right? And that was one of the things when the English department was talking to me is like, what people eat is personal. And I'm like, it's actually not personal. The way it intersects with corporations, the way it intersects with immigration policies, the way it intersects with race and gender and animals and all that sort of stuff shows that it's clearly a political choice that has other forms of implications. And so that's something that makes it that where we have to be able to address that, and as educators, we have to figure out ways to be able to move beyond that. Herbert Marcuse writes, what is proclaimed and practiced as tolerance today is in many of its most effective manifestations serving the cause of oppression. The elimination of violence and the reduction of suppression to the extent requiring protecting man and animals from cruelty and aggression are preconditions for the creation of humane society. As deterrence against nuclear war, communism and methods of pacification, neocolonial massacres, and violence and suppression are promulgated, practiced, and defined by democratic authoritarian governments alike. People are subject to the governments and are educated to disdain such practices as necessary for the preservation of the status quo. Tolerance is extended to policies, conditions, and modes of behavior which should not be tolerated because they are impeding, if not destroying, the chances for creating an existence without fear and misery. What that means is that we should not tolerate all opinions as being equal. We should not sit in a class discussion and allow someone to say racist or bigoted or sexist things without actually going after those individuals. And so, like in both, in the panel yesterday, there was conversations like, well, how do you come out as not being biased? Well, I don't try to not come off as not being biased. Rather, I express everyone has their biases. And so if you say things that I think is wrong, I'm going to explain to you why it's wrong. Now, you might be able to explain to me why I'm wrong as well, but clearly we all have our individual assumptions that we're bringing to the table, so there's no reason for why we should hide it. And we shouldn't just tolerate things, because if we want to have a truly tolerant society, you have to eliminate those people who are intolerable and teach them to be able to practice tolerance as opposed to just extending tolerance. So Herbert Marcuse has the idea of tolerance as a means and tolerance as an ends. And his argument is that we cannot extend tolerance as a means because then we just tolerate everything in a liberal enterprise where it's like, okay, free speech allows anyone to say whatever they want, and eventually we'll get to tolerance at the end point. But that's impossible because people who control speech, people who control universities, people who control academia, and corporations and capitalism are all people who are not interested in that end point. They're interested in a specific point of view, and they have the power to be able to enforce that upon the larger population. And so we have to withdraw tolerance from those sorts of institutions in order to have get to a point of tolerance at the end. Fortunately, he says, the reversal of the trend of the educational enterprise could be conceived by and could conceivably be enforced by students and teachers themselves by the systemic withdrawal of tolerance towards regressive opinions and movements through resistance at particular occasions at local and small group levels. As a teacher, if someone says something that's offensive, that is making the space unsafe for other students, right, they should leave that classroom. They should have their grades reduced. They should not just be tolerated within a space. We should withdraw tolerance from it. As students, when somebody says something offensive, opposed to just being like, whatever, I'm not going to change it, we'll just sort of go, I'll just make another comment, they should be actively called out. Classes should be stopped at those individual moments to be able to question those sort of violent discourses that are brought up, because otherwise, we're never going to have classroom spaces where there could truly be inclusive. And in order to have a productive classroom space, we need to have everyone feeling free to participate in that classroom space. And if people are silencing their own voices because they're afraid they're going to be attacked for promoting something that's progressive, we're not going to ever hit that progressive standpoint. And so what we really need to do is silence those people who are expressing oppressive, dominant positions and expressions. So, how do students like my experiment? Overwhelmingly and surprisingly, they actually enjoyed it when they went about doing it. One student wrote of her experience. With each trip to the store, I made the effort to verify that what I was buying was animal friendly as well as preferably free trade. My decisions have made me feel really content as a person as well as a student. My attempt at extra credit turned into a form of paying it forward. Your generosity initiated my generosity to companies that treat all lives as precious regardless of animal or human. I plan to continue this effort particularly because I enjoy diverging from my habitual way of shopping to try new or more ethical products. Of course, not everyone was as successful as that student as being able to change to more ethical forms of consumption. However, even those people who found the experience rewarding, and it caused them to reflect on their eating habits. So one of the students who failed wrote that this failure is not to say that I've completely given up. now that I'm away from home and it's meeting temptations, I've decided to make more of an effort. I had a feeling this process would be hard for me, but I've learned that eating meat is a morally disturbing practice, and I hope I can be determined enough to stop doing it. Thank you for bringing the problems of meat consumption to my studies. I don't think I would have really questioned it in its place in my own lifestyle otherwise. And other students talk about, like, when they go home for Thanksgiving and things like that, they feel pressured by their families to, eat the turkey and things like that because their family, their grandmother worked on making the meal so hard, and so they want to be able to do that. And so in those reflections are like, but when I come back from campus and Binghamton University, all the dining halls have vegan options, they're like, well, then I go ahead and go back to trying to find some of these vegan options instead of being able to eat that because now it's available to me. And I don't always do that, but I ask myself each time when I choose, to go for the veggie burger or the regular burger, why am I making this sort of choice and being able to do that? And it really begins to sort of change the sort of habits. And so how this relates back to things like, the conference and things like that, conferences, traveling to conferences, being at conferences, are very destructive to the environment, right? The gas, the planes, the lights, all these various different things are destructive. And so even when we run things waste-free, even when we do all these sort of recycling, there's huge environmental tolls and tolls that animals have to face just for us to get together to theorize. And so even in communities where everyone is presumably vegan or on board with the same sort of politics, it's important to always figure out how do we use these spaces to do something more and better with it, because at the point that our lives are more or less always going to have a greater environmental toll than we'll ever be able to give back, we have to do everything possible in each moment to figure out how can we live our lives in a way to make the world a better place, even if we're going to engage in practices that are destructive, right? And so a lot of times students who are first engaging with these are like, oh, well, you drive a car, well, you use lights, you have a computer, and you know what goes into rare earth mining? I'm like, yeah, I do. But the thing with veganism, and I like to oftentimes call it radical vegetarianism instead, is that it's got to be a process and not an endpoint. Like, it's like, yes, you can't get everything perfect, but every time I make one of those consumption choices, I ask, why do I do it, right? Like, so it took me, last year when I ran the conference, there was, white granulated sugar that's run with like bone shards and stuff like that. So I was like, okay, well, that was a mistake, so this time I'll make sure I get sugar in the raw, so that way it's not like that, right? And so it's like each time you realize that you make a mistake, instead of going to the knee-jerk reaction and defending it, it's better to sort of realize, oh, I did screw up. What can I do better next time in order to make that change, right? Because you're consistently going to go to a restaurant, you're going to order something that you think is vegan and it's not going to be vegan. And instead of being like, well, I did everything that was right, that's fine, I shouldn't, ignore it, is to be like, okay, now I know I have to ask another set of questions next time I go out to eat. I have to be more aware of those sort of things. And so it's constantly engaging in those sort of processes. So in the same way that I ask my students to sort of question how they internalize the course material, every semester I go through a similar reflective process. How well have I internalized the material and have I made the further changes that have taken place? Because otherwise, as an instructor, you end up sort of just repeating the same material, making the same arguments, and not really changing the way that you're going to live your life. And so really, since I've engaged in sort of doing Veg Pledge and internalization class material stuff, it's made me a better educator because I've cared more about the students' learning, and it's also made me more reflective on my own individual life because it forces me to sort of do those same sort of things. And so I think it's incredibly important that we learn to grade and pay attention to things that are not gradable and what takes place in the day-to-day lives, because otherwise academia just becomes the ivory tower reflection opposed to academia being what it should be for, which is a form of activism, to be able to create tangible forms of change. So, thank you.
We have lots and lots of time. More questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a comment. I like the idea of doing assignments that are extra credit, right? That are explicitly, I hate this phrase, but like pushing an agenda, because it seems to me like a really non-coercive way to give students the option to do work that's maybe a little more challenging than what you would necessarily offer as part of the course, right? So I think that's a really great idea. I'm going to try that. Because I often don't feel comfortable having my students read something, say, that's not published in an academic press, even though I think it's like an authority on some subject, because I will tell them, if it's not from an academic press, you can't cite it in your paper. So that seems to me like that could be a good way to negotiate those kinds of things. Like, for instance, I would love my students to read Brian Dominick's, zine on radical veganism, but would I necessarily assign it as part of the course material? Maybe not. So that seems like a good middle ground.
And I like this idea of having an agenda, I'm so glad this has come up at this conference, because this is the first semester that I've really started to not only talk about my personal life in the class, but actually to bring these issues into the pedagogy. And I'm waiting for those student evals at the end of the semester. I'm waiting for them to say, she has an agenda, whether it's, animal live or feminism, right? These are negatives, and I like what Joe just said. Maybe the best approach is to say, yes, I do have an agenda. That's why I'm doing what am I doing? Am I just, reading a book to you without any sort of critical, ideology behind it? So I think that maybe going forward, just saying, yes, I do have an agenda, and I think that my agenda is right, and that's why I'm here. That's why I'm in front of this classroom.
Yeah, I found that, students are less aggressive on me in course evaluations when I admit that there's an agenda than when I don't. When I don't, they're like, he was so opinionated when he got to that animal unit, and it was really biased. But when I'm like, I wear my vegan hoodie, they're like, okay, well, he's obviously going to promote to me some vegan propaganda here. But then it's sort of like, gives the, footnote of like, yeah, I'm promoting it now. What are your responses to why it's okay? So I think that sometimes clearing up that we all have agendas, and so now let's discuss our agendas is a good way to get past well, you're biased, because obviously we're all biased in general ways.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? You read some responses from students. You read a positive response, and then you read a response from a student who had failed with the assignment, but still sounded as though he or she was, because he had benefited from it. Have you gotten students who are absolutely resistant to this idea, who are hostile, who send a negative comment, not just about their failure at the assignment, but that they don't even want to be part of the assignment? And how do you respond to that kind of resistance?
I've gotten a couple. Since I've moved to internalization of class material, it doesn't force them to go vegetarian or vegan, so they have a bigger, leeway of what they choose to do. So some just choose to not go to Walmart, and I'm like, okay, well that's good, but it's like, I really wanted to go vegetarian and vegan, so I sort of am upset that I made that change. But that eliminated a lot of those criticisms, because then they could do something that they've always felt powerful to do. And then I also say that whatever you give yourself as a grade is what I will respect, and and I'll record on there as well. So those students will normally have, the students who don't like it, they won't be like, I hate this assignment. They normally give like a 5-sentence write-up being like, I tried to eat more peanut butter and jelly, and I made sure that my friends weren't being this racist. I think I deserved an A because I tried really hard. All right, I'll record it as a 96, it's only 10% of your grade, but you clearly did not get the material. And so I'm trying to figure out ways in which that self-grading mechanism for students who do that, because if I'm saying you grade the ungradable, they shouldn't get the 96 by doing that, that form of reflection along the lines. When I get pushback, it's mostly when they write their papers. A lot of people like to write their papers against animal rights and why it's okay to eat meat, and so then they have the local parenting argument. But they don't normally, they try and write it in a way that is not directed towards me, to try and, to make it more pitchable towards me, I guess. So I haven't had a lot of people being like, you're horrible. The people I get the most criticism from are people on the internet who find out about this. That's how I got called into the department, is that somebody who wasn't involved in the debate community or Binghamton University had heard through a series of, and then contacted the department head being like, you have a professor who is just giving out grades for being vegetarian and vegan. And so then I was like, okay, I have to explain to you. And it was fine, but it was just like, those are the people who are the biggest problems, people who aren't in the class, because if they're in the class, I have, a whole semester to explain to them more people.
I just wanted to say that is really interesting to hear about how much success you had, even just outside the classroom, but at the debate places where people commented that they really wanted to try it, but they might not have made that step before. And I think that it gives thoughts in terms of opportunities, even outside of the classroom, of creative ways to get people to try things, recognizing that sometimes when you give maybe giving a bit of legitimacy to it, then people are more comfortable stepping out of that bound. I know there's a lot of people that I might talk to who feel like even if they internally think they would want to try being vegetarian, they feel like there's still a certain stigma about it that they don't want to do it. But then when, like you say, if there's an extra credit or something else that kind of legitimizes that they can try that, and then that might
become a huge transformation for them and other people around them. So that I just wanted to say that's awesome to hear about, and thank you for sharing those stories and thinking about ways to use that creative way to get people more on board to try and have sort of change. It's really interesting.
I mean, it's both exciting and depressing at the same time.
Yes.
It's like, it's depressing because I've spent like so many semesters arguing and going through all these rational argumentations and then nothing. I'm like, here's some points. And they're like, oh, okay. I'm like, really, that's all I needed to do? But it's like, it's also refreshing because that's all you need to do, and then people want to, are willing to do it. So it's sort of like, awesome back and forth.
It seems like it also creates probably a community within your courses. It's kind of like I was thinking about people who sign up to lose weight, right? They feel motivated and encouraged when they're doing it with somebody else or with a group of other people. So I wonder, does that play a part at all? Like, do they kind of form a little community of sorts around this project? Or this?
I think they do.
Yeah, it sounds
I think they do a little bit. Because I seem like my courses, they are generally by the end of the semester, they're all sort of friends and they're very talkative in a way that I never was as a student. So.
That's cool. And I have a question too. How do you deal with guilt? Because I'm sure that comes up. Like once the realization is made that they've been benefiting from the exploitation of people, animals, whatever. Do you find that there's a lot of guilt present, and how do you work through that?
Yeah, sometimes it's so overwhelming because then you're like, well, now I realize how horrible of a person I've been. So now what do I do? And so I'm like, well, you have the ability to change that and be able to do things. So sort of like what Trevor was mentioning with Native studies, like the first thing is be aware of what's going on in the areas that you're at and figure out the where you need to be. So for instance, I have people who are like, I just can't do vegetarian and vegan, I just can't do it, whatever reasons, I don't really believe them, but they're like, if only I could find ethically killed meat. There's no ethically killed meat, but in upstate New York, there is farmers markets, and you can actually go to the farms and see the conditions and see all of that, and you have the ability to do that. So instead of saying, if only I can, you have the ability to do that in this area. And so I try and, for students who are, either for whatever reason they feel that they can, and I can't convince them that it's possible, I like showing them those other sorts of options, and then also being like, reminding them sort of as the process opposed to the end point is that, you continuously move in a direction, but step one is recognizing the way that you're complicit in violence, opposed to just sort of making excuses for that violence. So not letting guilt be, I don't want to say something that's to be guilt causing you to no longer take action. Use that guilt as a reason to figure out ways to overcome it.
I was wondering if you could recommend some Native American authors or authors who write from a Native perspective on, animal rights or animal welfare, because my concern is always, if I give my students this really beautiful piece about some Native Americans' perspective on animals, right, and a spiritual connection, I'm concerned that they're going to read that and think, oh, here's the justification for why if I have the right attitude, it's okay to kill animals, right? That's always my concern, and so I'm always looking for really good sources.
Got a few. The problem is I have not yet found like anything like a Native American veganism or something like that nature. I read a whole bunch of some of the authors and stuff that people cite in regards to the eco-narratives and stuff, like Deloria does a lot of that in terms of his discussions of myths. I can send you a few links if you could.
Yeah, that would be great. There's
because the problem is I've just got like a swath of research and stuff and a whole bunch of different books. I can send you pretty much what I've got in terms of this so that I can help you out. I think the most important thing is emphasizing this idea of like this cosmology and the idea that all lives are interconnected to the point that it's not necessary. I think also is emphasizing that we live in a culture and in an era where we need to understand the contemporary importance of things, and that, sure, 900 years ago it might have been important, if not entirely necessary, for them to eat the animals that they were living around, especially considering a lot of nomadic tribes, etc. But especially considering the status quo in terms of how easy it is for somebody to be vegetarian or vegan, that these worldviews take on different meanings and different interpretations, and that's why I'm trying to get at a little bit, that it's not just all about like, let's read this story and pretend like this is how everything exists now, but rather to understand different worldviews and perspectives and how we relate to the places that we inhabit, and now that can change the important and necessary relationship we have with that stuff. But I'll send you everything that I got.
I have a question for Trevor. So I'm really interested in post-colonial studies, which I think has a lot of parallels with Native studies. And I often grapple with the question of like how to, challenge the Eurocentric focus of theories, and to like incorporate, subaltern theories into our discourses, but how to do that without it becoming like kind of a voyeuristic endeavor, and trying to do it in like the least exploitative way. I mean, you mentioned like, the historical effects of like anthropological violence that just like look at communities in order to like more manage and control them. So
Sure.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on just kind of like navigating.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it comes down to having a level of integrity in terms of adherence to history and to the recorded knowledges that these communities and groups have, and not trying to like cherry pick individual ideas and things in order to fit a particular narrative that you're trying to spin. And it's hard to not fall into that trap, especially considering how academia comes down and like the way that we incentivize publishing, et cetera, like that. But I think one of the most important things is having the people tell their own stories. I think that goes a long way with having people understand that these are contemporary issues, and even sometimes there's like critiques of how the idea of even of post-colonial studies is problematic because we are still in the era of colonialism, right? And so bringing attention to the fact that these are lived experiences, that the Haudenosaunee people is not abstractions. These are people that live in town. There are plenty of people that live south of Syracuse, in Ontario, etc. That bringing in these narratives, bringing in these people, having them discuss their own perspectives. Like for example, there was an archaeological dig that was done on Vestal Parkway about 10 years ago, where hundreds of Haudenosaunee items were excavated from under the Vestal Parkway. And the Haudenosaunee people came and oversaw like the process of doing it. They presented on these objects and discussed their importance and their significance, and were able to bring a whole bunch of people kind of up to date in terms of their understanding of the culture, how it lives and develops, and also understanding some of the history and the legacy that the places that we consider to be banal and roads to be incredibly important aspects of people's lived experience. So I think an important thing is trying to invite more of those speakers and people to come into these things. And that's why I'm really interested in trying to get a Native Studies program here, because getting the Native American scholars that live in and around Binghamton or in upstate New York to be able to have a space for them to be able to develop their theories, use research grants and things to be able to further their own historical importance, and like be able to establish the ongoing legacies of colonialism as they function here is an important project. And so that I think goes a long way as well. But most importantly, I think having a level of integrity in terms of handling these as not just artifacts, but as lived experiences and aspects of people's ongoing existence. And these are people's emotions and people's lives, and taking and understanding that is one of the most important things.
I just have a comment for Pamela. I just wanted to say that I think it's so great that you include critical animal studies in literature, because I've definitely been exposed to that in my classroom, but I'm in environmental studies. So it seems very appropriate to the program. So I just wanted to say that I think it's so great to hear that that can also be incorporated in other areas of the university that might not necessarily be so relevant. Obviously there is a lot of literature written on it, but you wouldn't just think off the top of your head that that those two would have that connection.
Oh,
So I just think it's so incredible to hear.
Yeah, good, thank you. There really is a connection, and it's becoming impossible for me to ignore it now that I'm so deeply embedded in this research. And just this past week, something very exciting happened in one of my classes. It was an introduction to poetry and drama, and the students formed groups, and they get to choose any poem or play that they want to teach. And so they teach to the class, showing that they've achieved the objectives of the course, because I guide them through the first part of the semester. Here's how you locate important themes, issues, ideas, images, symbols, etc. And then by the end, they should be able to do that and discuss it and know how to create discussion questions for the class. And one of the groups was presenting a poem in which there was analyzed language used to describe a woman. And I talked with this group before class about it because we were kind of bouncing back and forth ideas, and I explained to them the ecofeminist way of reading that language, which is not to reject that language, which is what we've done for so long. Feminists said, you can't compare women to animals because this reduces us to our biological nature and reproduction and whatnot. And then ecofeminists come along decades later and say, when you do that, you are legitimizing the oppression of those animals, because you're saying that's not something that I want to be at all. And you're denying the whole evolutionary history of humans. But anyhow, so we had this great discussion before class, and then whenever they were teaching their poem to the class, one of the students raised her hand and said, I don't know if I'd like this poem to be written about me because it uses this animalized language and that's really degrading. And the students who were presenting said, well, that's one way of reading it, but the eco-feminist perspective might say this. It was fantastic because now this whole class of freshmen lit students had heard this idea that maybe it's not such a bad thing. Maybe nature isn't so terrible, right? So it was a really great moment. I was also thinking about in the writing classes, I'm having the students write a little bit more about their relationships with animals. And so I mentioned that I teach this essay, Am I Blue, at the beginning of the semester. And then we begin the class with a journal. So just to get the students into their, the frame of mind of the essay and writing, they respond to a discussion prompt. And the question that follows the reading of that essay is always describe an important relationship that you've had with an animal. And they come up with these profound stories of, the dog they rescued and the horse and their beloved cat, and they have these wonderful stories, and they get emotional when we're reading them back to the class. And it starts to make them, think about how important those relationships actually are. And then by the time later in the semester we get to Food Inc., and they're sort of thinking about it, not that we focus on this all semester, but we've already addressed this issue. They respond very strongly to the images of animal abuse. And if you've seen Food Inc., you know, in comparison to other documentaries about the food industry, it's very minimal in Food Inc. And I think they do that to make it palatable for a large audience. And that's why I actually like Food Inc. I there's some problems with it, but I actually like it because I think it reaches a larger audience because of that avoidance of a bigger issue that can be traumatic, to be honest. I don't want to traumatize the students. And then I tell them, if this is something that you're interested in, here are some other things that you can watch. And I give them the names. One of my students watched Earthlings last week. She came back to me and she was like, I made it through 10 minutes, I can't do more. I said, I warned you. I let them make that choice to do that. But it's working really well just to get them thinking about these relationships with animals, because then one student wrote her final paper on her experiences with the 4-H. And she had this powerful story. It was one of the best narratives I've read, where she raised this calf, and she loved this animal, and I guess the idea is you eventually auction the animal off and he's slaughtered. And the story was very powerful because somebody, I think an uncle or something, knew how important this animal was to the student. So he purchased the animal at the auction and gifted him back to her so that she could keep him, right? And she was just thrilled. And it was really strange, though, how she addressed it in the paper, because she said, this was a unique experience, but she said, I know that in the end, these animals have to be slaughtered. I said, wait a minute, you just told me that they don't have to. You just told me this story of how meaningful it was that it did not happen in this one instance. So I'm trying to kind of push back a little bit with, and it is difficult in this community because it's very, very rural, and it's very much a hunting-centric culture where they just haven't really been pushed to think about this. And like I said, I'm the first exposure to a vegetarian I think that many of them have had. They're genuinely shocked by this. They can't fathom it. So I'm hoping that just my presence there is sort of opening doors. And I've had since I've been more open about it this semester. I'm still afraid. I mentioned this yesterday about larger panel. I'm a junior faculty member. It's a little scary because student evaluations are very key, and that's why I ask these questions about what do you do if you have an agenda. But just in being open about it, students come to my office now just to ask, and I've had these great conversations, and it's just really it's really heartening actually.
Yeah, that sounds very incredible. Thank you. Anything further?
Yeah, I was wondering, what novels and poems and poets and poetry do you use that you think works really well at sort of promoting some of those themes and messages? Like you mentioned a bunch of authors, but are there ones that you find that students connect with more? Because obviously we have literature courses and some stuff.
That was one of the questions too I wanted to pose to the audience, whether there are other texts that you all have seen used in the classroom that have been really useful for that. My research right now focuses on Alice Walker, so I bring a ton of her literature into the classroom, and there is a lot of problematic as Walker can be on this issue. I think her writings really point to animal liberation, so I do teach a lot of Alice Walker in my classes. I'm trying to think of some other essays in the composition course because those are nonfiction essays. One of the essays that I've used because it's in the textbook, really it's sort of a troubling essay. It's by Michael Pollan of The Omnivore's Dilemma, and it's called The Cooking Animal, and it's talks about how the human is we're different, we're set apart because we're the only animals who cook, right? And this has made us very lazy because we don't have to go out and hunt now. And this is why we're all obese, according to Pollan, because we're not out hunting. So it's a really interesting essay, but that gets students thinking a little bit too about the nature of discourse around food and around animals too. So one of the questions I wanted to ask to the audience too was if you had any other suggestions or ideas, texts that you've used or that you've seen used in the classroom, because I think this is such a great forum to kind of get these ideas going, especially since I'm relatively new to the field and I'm really working to incorporate it into the classroom.
There's a novel called The Ethical Assassin by David Liss. It is, in my opinion, not a very good novel, but it's an animal liberation story, right? That's meant to sort of highlight utilitarian philosophy, which sounds like so weird to describe a novel this way, right? So the main character, Lem, witnesses a crime, totally inexplicable to him, right? And the person who committed the crime sort of takes Lem under his wing as like, well, you have to do everything I say, right? Because if I let you go, you're going to turn me into the cops. But I'm an ethical assassin, right? So I'm going to take care of you, and I'm not going to release you from my care until I know that you're not going to snitch on me. And it turns out that this assassin is doing animal liberation actions, and so the whole novel ends up being about what would drive someone to do this kind of stuff, what are the conditions that make this character want to do these things. And I TA'd for a course where this was taught, and the professor is not, a vegetarian or an animal rights activist or anything like that, but he, I think he taught it because it's like an interesting piece for students to read. And unfortunately, I don't think that novel does anything to sort of implant caring about animals. It's really like a drama, a crime sort of drama, and I think it's really easy for students to put that down and to not think about it again, because it is kind of superficial and it doesn't grab at your emotions the way I think really good literature does. But if you want to, do something that's explicitly about what might animal liberation activities look like today, like that's.
What, can you say the title
Yeah,
again?
The Ethical Assassin by David Liss, Liss. You can read it in an afternoon, it's very light.
I've had professors professors teaches a course called Geographies of Mass Violence, and he concludes the semester by reading, what's it called? Eating Animals by Jonathan Sacco. Because I'm sure y'all have read it. It's not like really, it has like kind of an agenda, but it's like really palatable for a lot of people. And then we also read in another one of my classes, what's it called? David Foster Wallace's Something About a Lobster. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Remember the Lobster, David Foster Wallace, Remember the Lobster. And that seemed to get a lot of people thinking.
That's a good suggestion.
I do science fiction a lot, and so I actually like Kendra's theme for it, because it doesn't have an explicit animal theme. It starts, so it's just the way that violence is building up within culture, and then at the very end, spoiler alert, you determine that the genocide that they do when they eliminate the bug race, that it was actually an intelligent hive mind that was trying to reach out and communicate but couldn't communicate. And the follow-up book, Speaker for the Dead, is about trying to reseed the populations and what do we do in sort of ethical relationships to it. So, bracketing the author, I think that the book itself, it allows people to connect with the way the violence between brothers and then between people within the military builds, and so all that creates a common language throughout the entire book. You're pretty much rah, humans have to survive to beat this horrible alien race that's otherwise going to exterminate us, and then not the end of that shift takes place, and so then at the very end you can have the conversations about what do we do for the other that you don't consider other, because it's just so different, and so then it builds up on all the language that they had used beforehand about the ways in which the violence takes place earlier. So I'm sort of using that novel, and I also like the movie Starship Troopers for some of the
The novel, Upton Sinclair's classic, The Jungle, worked really well. I've never taught it before, but I taught it this semester. And, I didn't have the animal agenda for this one. It was just this, I'm teaching this period of literature, and this is a classic, you need to know it. And there's not an epigraph, there's a quotation in the intro that Upton Sinclair said when he wrote the novel. He aimed at the public's heart, but he hit them in the stomach, right? And he was, the goal was really to focus on the exploitation of the workers and the evils of capitalism. But when I asked the students to respond in these online discussions before class, what is the most shocking scene from the novel? Almost all of them said it's those scenes of animal abuse, right? They're early in the novel where there's this description of what's happening to the cows and to the pigs in this highly mechanized factory, and the students are shocked by this, more so than they are the story of the protagonist, Yorgos, right? He goes through these terrible, terrible things. But it's got that brief section of the novel that focuses on the animals that really hits them. And then, we had a conversation about what, how has this changed? Because this is over 100 years ago at this point. And, we talked about, there was, the sanitation acts that were passed in response to kind of a public outcry following the publication of that novel. But as far as animals are concerned, I said, it's gotten worse. It's gotten worse, and the numbers are vastly ramped up from what you're seeing here, because it's just, this described like this one after, this animal's just coming through. And I said, it's very much worse for the animals now. So, so the conversation just, it comes up, and it doesn't even, we don't even have to be the ones to bring it up. The students said this was the hardest part of the novel for me to read.
I thought Frankenstein, Carol Adams' interpretation, that's half the reason I wanted to interpret it. But really interesting, especially your stuff about modern Prometheus and the discussion of how Mary Shelley and her husband were vegetarians, and about how Frankenstein is vegetarian, and he only eats the nuts. He plays with the squirrels. He's chilling out in the forest, having a good time, and then obviously everybody monstrizes him because he exists in this, has a different ethical relationship than them. And I don't know, it really makes you question technology and science and how we conceptualize who the true monsters are. Is it the creators of the technology? If they don't monitor and keep touching with their technologies and what they create, kind of stuff.
I think Carol Adams' entire bibliography is social politics of hate is like really good fodder for literature.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Hers is really good. And I do teach Frankenstein in my women's lit class actually, and it's such an interesting discussion because we always start with how do you envision the Frankenstein monster, right? And they have these, they kind of picture him as that they've seen him in these representations on TV or in movies, and then they read the book and it's totally different. He doesn't look, he doesn't act, he doesn't speak at all like these representations where he's just kind of moaning and shambling around. He's agile, he's eloquent, and the only reason that he turns to violence is because humans have effectively othered him, right? They reject him. Humans create him and then they cast him out of their society. So that's why he returns to violence.
When I was a grad student, I had to take like Brit Little and stuff like that, and so I had to read like Clarissa, Pamela, like all this like old like literature, and so in all those sort of novels, there's always the female character always goes through acts of resistance because they don't want to marry the person who they're forced to marry, and they do that by refusing to eat. And so I started tracing and paying attention to what do they eat, and consistently they are turning down meat and eating vegetarian. And so the only mentions of when they eat something is generally a vegetarian mention, and all the mentions of when they're refusing is the chicken dinner or the turkey or stuff along those lines. And then I started realizing that in sort of the unspoken portions of these texts, there's consistently references to, vegetarianism as an act of resistance to things like patriarchy. And so, I wrote a paper on course of basically just every mention of meat going through and every mention of resistance. And my professor said it was a deliberate misreading of the text, but at the same point he got what I was saying because it was so consistent and prevalent as a way to sort of see, the way that these sort of connections have been thought about prior, but were not necessarily talked about either.
That's really interesting. I have to reread that.
I was going to bring up two things. One, I'm still trying to find a way to make Black Beauty relevant to my contemporary moral problems class because I remember reading that as a kid and being like, oh, Anna, she was an animal rights activist, and it's a strange omission that, this is such a classic book and so many children read it, but we don't really talk about that. She, of course, was also disabled, so there's an interesting connection there as well. And you feel the social forces acting on Black Beauty, right, are exactly the same as we might imagine a Victorian woman would have felt, right? This powerlessness, it's just bad fortune, if you end up in a situation that you can't control, you're lucky if it's better, right? Because Black Beauty has houses that take really good care of him, but then misfortune happens, right? There's no protection for him and he ends up in bad places, so trying to find a way to work that one in because it doesn't talk about food per se. Horses weren't eaten at that time in that place. Maybe a way to get students to think about it without feeling like you're going after their dietary habits. But then I just remember Pamela talked about a short story last year, I think called Blood Meridian or something of that nature. There's aliens that.
Blood Child.
Blood Child. Okay. If you could talk about that, that would be great.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great. It's a science fiction. So if you do science fiction, Octavia Butler's fantastic, and the story of Blood Child is essentially about humans leave the planet Earth because they've destroyed it in some way, and they try to colonize another planet. But when they arrive there, the race who lives there says, "Okay, you can stay essentially, but you have to provide for us in some way, or you've got to pay the rent." And so the race who lives there kind of impregnates the males. It's like a reverse gendered pregnancy story, Octavia Butler said. So the males actually bear these, they're described like grubs who come out of their skin, and it's really horrific whenever it actually happens. And I'm trying to think, Cassie, in what context I was talking about the story last year. Because I think there's some really interesting, now that I'm looking back, some really interesting animal ethics there. Because then, the young human male has to go out and slaughter an animal so that they can take the grubs out of the human male and put them into the animal to eat its flesh instead of the human. It's
gory.
It's very gory. It's a very gory story. There's probably a lot to be said. In relation to CAS, now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, I remember I think we were talking about it over lunch, and I don't remember why, except that you thought it was really interesting. And You know, I've been meaning to read that. I would really like to incorporate fiction into my philosophy classes because I feel like it's a really effective way to get people to have that emotional connection to some subject that otherwise they wouldn't, you know, because when you've suspended your disbelief when it's science fiction or it's fantasy, right? Well, this isn't something that's happening in the real world, so I can care about these unicorns or whatever, right? Without feeling like I have to be vegetarian. On the other hand, I also want to be careful about what I pick because, you know, class time is precious and there's this expectation you're going to teach this core material, right? So it's like, how do I decide? I rely on other people to tell me, you know, what's most effective. And that sounds like it could be a really good one.
Thank you very much.
More panels starting at 11. Schedules in the week.
I don't judge many rounds anymore.